I sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the divorce papers resting on the coffee table in front of me. My hands were clasped together, my fingers interlocked so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The weight of what I was about to do pressed heavily on my chest. But I didn't waver. There was no room for doubt anymore. I had seen everything with my own eyes. I had heard the words come out of her mouth. And yet, part of me still couldn't believe it. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each second that passed felt like an eternity, stretching out into an unbearable limbo. But then, at exactly 9:42 p.m., I heard it, the sound of her keys jingling outside the front door. She was home. I clenched my jaw, forcing my expression into a mask of indifference as the key slid into the lock. The door swung open, and there she was, Emily. She stepped inside, looking as radiant as ever, her long blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, her red dress hugging her figure just right. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she walked in, carrying the faint scent of expensive perfume. And she was smiling, that same smile I had once adored, the one that had made me fall in love with her all those years ago. But now it made my stomach turn. She set her purse down and stretched, sighing as if she had just come home from a long day at work. "Hey, babe," she said casually, her voice light, carefree, like nothing had changed, like she hadn't just spent the evening in another man's bed. I didn't say anything. I simply sat there watching her. My silence made her pause. She turned to me, her brows knitting together slightly. "What's with the serious face?" I exhaled slowly and leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Then, in the coldest, most emotionless voice I could muster, I said, "You have 10 minutes. Sign the papers and leave." The smile disappeared from her face instantly. Her eyes widened slightly as if she hadn't heard me correctly. "Wait, what?" She let out a small, nervous laugh, shifting on her feet. "Are you joking?" I didn't blink. I didn't move. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Her gaze flickered to the coffee table, where the stack of neatly prepared divorce papers sat waiting. She took a hesitant step closer, confusion etched into her features. "What the hell is this?" I gestured toward the papers. "Your exit plan." Her mouth opened, then closed. I could see the gears turning in her head, the panic starting to settle in as she realized I wasn't bluffing. "I don't understand." I tilted my head. "Don't insult me, Emily." She flinched slightly, but I wasn't done. I sat up straighter, my tone measured. "I know everything. About you. About Daniel." And there it was, the exact moment her world shattered. She sucked in a breath, her face turning pale. "What are you talking about?" I let out a humorless chuckle. "Don't play dumb. I've seen the texts, the receipts, the hotel bookings. I even saw the pictures. You weren't exactly careful, Emily." She shook her head, as if trying to will away reality. No, this isn't." I cut her off. "Spare me the fake tears. It's over. You've been caught. The only thing left to do is sign and leave." Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her mind scrambling for an escape. I had seen this look before on liars, on manipulators, and that's exactly what she was. But the real kicker? She had no idea what was coming next, because this wasn't just between the two of us. Daniel's wife was involved now, and Emily was about to find out just how much of a disaster her affair had truly become. Emily stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, her mind clearly racing to process what I had just said. The confident, carefree woman who had walked through the door with a smile was gone. What remained was someone desperately grasping for control, only to find none. "You're wrong," she finally whispered, shaking her head. "You're confused, Jason. I don't know what you think you saw, but—" I cut her off with a slow, humorless chuckle. "Don't." She flinched. I leaned back against the couch, crossing my arms. "Don't embarrass yourself further, Emily. You got caught. Accept it. Own it." Her face twisted, and for a moment, she looked genuinely afraid. Not of me, but of the weight of her own actions finally crashing down on her. Then, like clockwork, the anger came. "So what?" she snapped, her voice shaking. You think you're the perfect husband? You think you never made mistakes? I exhaled sharply through my nose, staring at her in disbelief. Wow, that's where you're going with this? Trying to blame me? She threw her hands up. Oh, so now I'm just the villain? You think marriages fall apart for no reason? Maybe if you had paid more attention to me. I slammed my hand down on the coffee table, making her jump. Are you seriously blaming me for you screwing my friend? Her lip quivered. Before she could finish, the doorbell rang. Her entire body went rigid. She glanced at the door, then back at me. Who is that? I smirked. Why don't you find out? She hesitated, then slowly walked over and opened the door. And there she was, Rachel, Daniel's wife. Emily sucked in a sharp breath, stepping back as if Rachel's very presence burned her. The color drained from her face. What are you doing here? Rachel didn't answer right away. She simply walked inside, her heels clicking against the floor with deliberate, controlled movements. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't here for a dramatic confrontation. She was calm, and that made it even worse. Sit down, Emily, Rachel said coolly. We need to talk. Emily turned to me, her eyes wide. Jason. I shrugged. What? Did you really think I'd keep this between us? That you'd just sign these papers, cry a little and walk away? Rachel crossed her arms, her voice like ice. My husband packed his bags an hour ago. He's on his way to his mother's house. We're done. Emily let out a strangled laugh. No, you're lying. Daniel would never. Rachel pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and turned it around. There, in bright, unforgiving clarity, was a text from Daniel. I messed up. I'll be out of the house by morning. I don't expect forgiveness. Emily's breath hitched. You destroyed 2 marriages, Emily? Rachel said, tilting her head. And for what? I watched as my wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, began to crumble. The realization, the consequences, the weight of everything she had done was finally, truly hitting her. She had spent months sneaking around, lying, gaslighting me. And for what? A man who had just abandoned her without a fight? Daniel, she whispered. Rachel smiled, a cruel, victorious smile. Go ahead. Call him. Emily's hands shook as she reached for her phone. She tapped his contact, brought the phone to her ear. 1 ring. 2. Straight to voicemail. Rachel let out a small, satisfied sigh. Guess he's done with you too. Emily's knees buckled, and she grabbed onto the back of the couch for support. Her breath was shallow, uneven. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the months of lies. The late nights. The gaslighting. The moments when she looked me in the eye and told me she loved me while she was sneaking off to be with him. No, I didn't feel sorry for her at all. Rachel turned to me, nodding. I'll let you 2 finish up. Just wanted to make sure she knew exactly where she stood before I left. She stepped toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Emily? My wife, ex-wife, looked up at her, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Rachel smiled. Enjoy being alone. And with that, she walked out. Emily turned to me, desperation flickering in her eyes. Jason, please, we can fix this. I made a mistake. I stood up, towering over her. No, Emily, you made a choice. Asterisk, asterisk. And now you're finally facing the consequences. Asterisk, asterisk. Emily stood there, her face pale, her breath shallow. The weight of everything was finally pressing down on her. And for the first time, she wasn't the one in control. The woman who had come home smiling just minutes ago was now visibly shaking. I could see the gears turning in her mind. She was desperate. Desperate to find a way out, a way to spin this, to manipulate me into believing that this wasn't her fault. Jason, please, she whispered, stepping toward me. I didn't move. Please, what? Her lip quivered. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. We've been together for so long. Don't throw it all away over 1 mistake. I let out a sharp laugh, shaking my head. 1 mistake? Emily, this wasn't some drunken accident. This wasn't a moment of weakness. You carried this affair for months, lied to my face, gaslit me, And now that you're caught, you want to talk about fixing things. Her eyes darted to the divorce papers on the table. Her fingers trembled as she reached for them, flipping through the pages as if she could erase them just by touching them. "We don't have to do this," she said, her voice cracking. "We can go to therapy, we can work through it." I slammed my palm against the table, making her jump. "Stop." She went silent. I exhaled through my nose, forcing my voice to stay calm. "You think I'd ever be able to trust you again? After everything?" She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as if trying to hold back tears. But I didn't buy it. Not anymore. She wasn't crying because she regretted cheating. She was crying because she got caught. "It didn't mean anything," she blurted out suddenly, her voice desperate. That was the last straw. I let out another humorless chuckle, shaking my head. "It didn't mean anything?" I repeated. "Emily, you risked our marriage, our life together, for something that didn't mean anything? That makes it worse." She opened her mouth, then shut it. She had nothing. No excuse. No justification. Just silence. Then her expression shifted. The panic faded slightly, replaced by something else. Calculation. "Jason," she said softly, stepping closer. "We built a life together. We love each other. You don't just throw that away, right?" I clenched my jaw. I knew what she was doing. Trying to play on my emotions, trying to remind me of the good times so I'd hesitate. But I wasn't hesitating. Not anymore. I reached for the divorce papers and held them out to her. "Sign." She hesitated, her fingers twitching. Then, she let out a shuddering breath. "What if I don't?" I smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "Then I release the evidence." Her breath hitched. "You wouldn't." I tilted my head. "Try me." She swallowed hard, her gaze flickering between me and the papers. Then, finally, she grabbed a pen with trembling fingers and scribbled her name at the bottom of the page. It was over. She had officially signed herself out of my life. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound in the room was the distant ticking of the clock. Then, quietly, she asked, "Where do I go?" I shrugged. "That's not my problem." She let out a shaky breath, wiping her eyes. Then, she turned to leave. She made it to the door before she hesitated. "Jason." I didn't answer. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I met her gaze, and for the first time I felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just peace. "No," I said simply. She nodded, then walked out. And just like that, she was gone. For the first time in months, I could finally breathe. The moment the door closed behind Emily, the house fell into an eerie silence. I stood there, motionless, staring at the divorce papers with her shaky signature at the bottom. It was done. The woman I had spent years building a life with, the woman I had trusted, the woman I had once believed in. She was gone. I exhaled, the weight in my chest not quite lifting yet. I wasn't naive enough to think that just because she walked out, all the pain would disappear. No, the betrayal still sat heavy in my gut. It would take time. I collapsed onto the couch, running a hand down my face. My body felt drained, like I had been carrying a weight for so long that now, without it, I didn't know what to do with myself. Then my phone buzzed. I reached for it instinctively, expecting another meaningless notification. But when I saw the name on the screen, my brows furrowed. Rachel, Daniel's wife. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yeah." Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something unreadable. "She signed." I glanced at the papers. "Yeah, she's gone." There was a pause. "Good." Silence stretched between us. I didn't know what else to say. Neither did she. Finally, she sighed. "You doing okay?" I let out a bitter chuckle. "Define okay." Another pause. Then she said, "I think we should talk. Face to face." I blinked. "About what?" "About what happens next." I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but I found myself nodding anyway. "All right. When and where?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll text you the address." I agreed, and the call ended. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at my reflection in the dark TV screen. What happens next? I had no idea, but I was about to find out. The next morning, I woke up to an unfamiliar sensation: silence. For years, I had woken up to the sound of Emily moving around the house. The clatter of dishes, the hum of a hairdryer, the quiet shuffle of feet as she got ready for the day. But today, nothing. Felt strange, almost surreal. The bed beside me was empty, cold. No trace of her remained except for the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. It should have hurt, but all I felt was relief. I showered, dressed, and grabbed my car keys, checking my phone to see Rachel's text. Meet me at Perkins Diner. 9:30 a.m. I glanced at the time. 9:12 a.m. Just enough time to get there. 15 minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet diner on the edge of town. Rachel was already there, sitting at a booth by the window. She looked different, more composed than last night, but there was still a weariness behind her eyes. A woman who had just had her entire world turned upside down. Much like me, I slid into the seat across from her. Morning. She nodded, stirring a cup of coffee in front of her. You sleep? I snorted. Barely. Yeah, me neither. The waitress came by, and I ordered a black coffee, not really trusting my stomach with anything heavier. Rachel finally leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly. I needed to see you in person because this isn't over yet. I frowned. What do you mean? She took a deep breath, pulling out her phone and scrolling through something before sliding it across the table. I glanced down and felt my jaw tighten. It was a message thread between Emily and Daniel. Emily, I don't know what to do. Jason was so cold. He barely reacted. It's like he doesn't even care that I'm leaving. Daniel, he's bluffing. He'll break eventually. Just give it time. He loves you too much to actually go through with it. Emily, I hope you're right. I can't lose everything over this. I clenched my fists. They're still talking? I asked, my voice controlled but laced with anger. Rachel nodded. Not just talking. Planning. That made my blood run cold. Planning what? She sighed. Emily doesn't want to lose everything. The house, the money, the reputation. So she's trying to figure out how to spin this. Maybe even get you to reconsider. I let out a humorless laugh. Unbelievable. Rachel tilted her head. And Daniel? Well, he's scared of what I'll do next. He knows I could ruin him if I wanted to. I narrowed my eyes. And what do you want to do? She smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. I want them to feel what we felt. I want them to know what it's like to have their world ripped apart. And I want them to lose. I studied her carefully. There was something in her voice, something sharp and unwavering. She wasn't here for closure. She was here for justice. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that meant. I sat back in my seat, staring at Rachel as her words settled in. I want them to lose. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. She had made up her mind, and now she was giving me a choice, to walk away or to stand beside her. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness ground me before I spoke. And how exactly do you plan on making them lose? Rachel smirked, but it wasn't a playful smirk. It was calculated, cold. She slid her phone across the table again. This time it wasn't just a text thread. It was screenshots, dozens of them. Emily and Daniel hadn't just been careless. They had been reckless. Hotel receipts, explicit messages, even pictures they had sent to each other. Rachel had everything. I've been gathering this for weeks, she said, her voice low. Waiting for the right time. I exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down my face. Jesus. I know, she said, her expression darkening. I knew something was off, so I started checking our shared phone plan, looking at the call logs. Then one night I followed him. And well, I saw everything. I shook my head. How did you keep this to yourself for so long? Rachel chuckled bitterly. Because I knew if I exploded right away, they'd just twist it around. Play the victims. Make it seem like we were the problem. I nodded. I understood that all too well. Emily had always been good at shifting blame, twisting reality to make herself look innocent. She would cry, she would beg, she would make it seem like I was overreacting. Rachel tapped a finger against the table. "We can use this, Jason. We can control how this ends." I let out a slow breath, considering my options. I could walk away, take my signed divorce papers, let Emily go, and move on. Or I could make sure she and Daniel got exactly what they deserved. I met Rachel's gaze, and for the first time, I felt something I hadn't in months. A sense of control. "All right," I said finally. "Let's do this." Her smile widened. "Good. Then here's the plan." Rachel and I spent the next hour strategizing, going over every piece of evidence she had gathered. It wasn't just damning, it was irrefutable. By the time we left the diner, I knew exactly what needed to be done. That night, I sat at home, staring at my phone. I had drafted a message but hesitated before hitting send. Then finally I did. Emily, I want to talk. Meet me tomorrow at noon. Our house." It didn't take long for her to reply. "Emily, Jason, of course. I'll be there." The bait was set, and she had no idea what was coming. The next afternoon, I stood in the living room, waiting. The divorce papers were still on the coffee table, untouched from the night before. My heartbeat was steady, my mind clear. This was the final chapter, the moment where I took back control of my life. At exactly noon, the front door creaked open. Emily stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room as if she expected something terrible to happen. "Jason," she breathed, her voice soft, almost hopeful. "I'm so glad you wanted to talk." I nodded toward the couch. "Sit." She hesitated, then obeyed, crossing her legs as she tried to compose herself. "Look," she began. "I know you're hurt. I know I made mistakes. But," I held up a hand. "Save it." Her mouth snapped shut. I sat across from her, my elbows resting on my knees. "I want you to understand something, Emily. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not even hurt. I'm just done." Her face fell. "Jason, we don't have to." "Yes, we do," I interrupted. "Because no matter what you say, no matter how many excuses you make, you and I both know the truth. You betrayed me, and now you're facing the consequences." I slid the divorce papers toward her. "Sign them. And this time, I don't want to hear any more excuses." She stared at the papers, her fingers trembling. "Jason, please." I exhaled, shaking my head. "No more games. No more lies. Just sign, Emily." For a moment, I thought she was going to refuse. But then, with a shaky breath, she picked up the pen and scribbled her name at the bottom. It was over. The woman I had once loved, the life I had once built, the future I had once imagined. All of it ended with a signature. Emily wiped her eyes, but I could see the resignation in her posture. She had lost. She knew it. I stood, tucking the papers into a folder. "I'll have my lawyer finalize everything. You have until the end of the week to get your things and leave." She sniffled, glancing at me one last time. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I considered that for a long moment. Then, finally, I smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Maybe," I admitted. "But that doesn't mean I'll ever want you back." She nodded, standing slowly. "Goodbye, Jason." I watched as she walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. And just like that, she was gone. I let out a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in months. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. "Rachel, it's done?" I smiled. "Yeah, it's done." She sent a simple reply. "Good. Now, let's move forward." And for the first time in a long time, I knew I was finally free. A new beginning was waiting, and I was ready. The next afternoon, I stood in the living room, waiting. The divorce papers were still on the coffee table, untouched from the night before. My heartbeat was steady, my mind clear. This was the final chapter, the moment where I took back control of my life. At exactly noon, the front door creaked open. Emily stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room as if she expected something terrible to happen. "Jason," she breathed, her voice soft, almost hopeful. I'm so glad you wanted to talk. I nodded toward the couch. Sit. She hesitated, then obeyed, crossing her legs as she tried to compose herself. Look, she began. I know you're hurt. I know I made mistakes. But, I held up a hand. Save it. Her mouth snapped shut. I sat across from her, my elbows resting on my knees. I want you to understand something, Emily. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not even hurt. I'm just done. Her face fell. Jason, we don't have to. Yes, we do, I interrupted. Because no matter what you say, no matter how many excuses you make, you and I both know the truth. You betrayed me, and now you're facing the consequences. I slid the divorce papers toward her. Sign them. And this time, I don't want to hear any more excuses. She stared at the papers, her fingers trembling. Jason, please. I exhaled, shaking my head. No more games. No more lies. Just sign, Emily. For a moment, I thought she was going to refuse. But then, with a shaky breath, she picked up the pen and scribbled her name at the bottom. It was over. The woman I had once loved, the life I had once built, the future I had once imagined. All of it ended with a signature. Emily wiped her eyes, but I could see the resignation in her posture. She had lost. She knew it. I stood, tucking the papers into a folder. I'll have my lawyer finalize everything. You have until the end of the week to get your things and leave. She sniffled, glancing at me one last time. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? I considered that for a long moment. Then, finally, I smiled a real, genuine smile. Maybe, I admitted. But that doesn't mean I'll ever want you back. She nodded, standing slowly. Goodbye, Jason. I watched as she walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. And just like that, she was gone. I let out a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in months. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. Rachel, it's done? I smiled. Yeah, it's done. She sent a simple reply. Good. Now, let's move forward. I set my phone down and looked around the empty house, the silence no longer feeling suffocating. Felt peaceful. For the first time in a long time, I realized something. The best revenge wasn't making Emily suffer. It wasn't exposing her or humiliating her. It was simply letting go and living a better life without her. And that's exactly what I was going to do.